Hi, my name is Abigail, and I will be doing a dissertation portfolio presentation. My dissertation asks a simple but important question on why does Malaysia's petrol subsidy persist? Fossil fuel subsidies are widely recognized as fiscally costly, regressive in distribution, and economically inefficient. Yet, governments around the world struggle to remove them. Looking at this graph, we see that globally, fossil fuel subsidies are enormous. Estimated at around 7% of global GDP, this tells us that subsidy persistence is not a minor policy issue, but a very relevant and major political economic phenomenon. This graph shows the co-movement between global oil prices and Malaysia's fuel subsidy expenditure. Malaysia as a case study is so unique because if you look at this graph, the orange line first represents the oil prices while the blue line shows government subsidy spending. We can see that subsidy cost rises sharply when global prices increase because the government absorbs the difference to keep domestic fuel prices low. This means that periods of high oil prices create significant fiscal pressure on the government. In principle, these moments should provide strong incentives to reform subsidies. However, as we will see later, reform attempts during these periods are often temporary or reversed. Look at Malaysia's reform attempts timeline. Since 2008, Malaysia has attempted major subsidy reform multiple times, including price hikes, managed floats, price caps, and targeted schemes. However, none of these reforms have been fully sustained. The central empirical puzzle, therefore, is not a lack of reform attempts, but lack of a successful one. This table summarizes the main explanations offered in the literature. There are two themes which can explain this subsidy persistence. Firstly, structural political economy models emphasize deep conditions such as resource rents and distributive bargains. In resource-rich economies, government rely less on taxation and more on universal benefits, which weakens accountability and embeds subsidies in the fiscal system. Whereas strategic or game theoretic models focus instead on incentives and interaction. They highlight problems such as low credibility, collective actions asymmetries, and the electoral value of visible benefits. These mechanisms explain why reform can be politically risky even when it is economically desirable. Each perspective captures an important part of the story. Structural models explain why subsidies become entrenched in the first place, while strategic models explain why they are difficult to remove. However, these strands are usually analyzed separately and rarely integrated into a single framework, particularly in the Malaysian context. This fragmentation motivates the approach of my project, which aims to combine these mechanisms and explain why subsidies persist over time. With this gap, existing research provides fragmented explanation, structural conditions on one side, strategic incentives on the other, and empirical case studies separately. What is missing is a unified economic framework that brings these strands together to explain Malaysia's experience. My project aims to fill that gap. This slide summarizes the overall approach I would take for this project. I begin by integrating insights from the political economy literature into a single framework, focusing on factors such as resource rents, credibility, collective actions, and electoral incentive. I then apply this framework to Malaysia, using evidence on reform attempts, policy reversals, fuel prices, and subsidy spending to assess whether these mechanisms can explain the persistence we observe. Finally, I compare Malaysia with comparable countries such as Indonesia and Iran, where reform has been successful, to understand which constraints differ and when reform becomes feasible. So the method moves from theory to case analysis to comparative insights. At the core of my analysis is a dynamic political commitment game involving three key actors: the government, citizens, and interest groups. Governments face a trade-off between fiscal pressure and political survival, while citizens would bear immediate price increases while compensation is delayed and uncertain. Meanwhile, organized groups that benefit from subsidies can mobilize strongly against reform. Because citizens do not fully trust future compensation, reform becomes politically risky. This uncertainty is central to understanding why subsidies persist. This diagram illustrates why subsidy persistence can be understood as a self-reinforcing political equilibrium. The interaction can be viewed as a sequential game, where decisions occur in stages, while with incomplete information about government commitment. First, the government chooses a policy, either maintaining subsidies or announcing reform with compensation. Citizens then respond. They may accept the reform or resist through protest or electoral punishment, especially if they expect immediate price increases. Anticipating this reaction, the government decides whether to follow through or roll back. In many cases, political pressure leads to a partial or full reversal. These outcomes update public beliefs. Each rollback lowers credibility, making future promises of compensation less believable. Because the game is repeated over time, the history matters. Low credibility makes reform increasingly risky, so maintaining subsidies becomes the safer political strategy. Over time, the system settles into a low credibility equilibrium in which reforms are attempted but rarely sustained. Persistence therefore arises from strategic interaction and expectations rather than from ignorance of the economic costs. The main strengths of this approach is that it integrates multiple explanations into a single framework. Rather than focusing on just one mechanism, the model captures how structural conditions and strategic incentives interact over time. It also accounts for credibility and path dependence, meaning past policy outcomes shape future reform possibilities. In addition, the framework explicitly models the trade-off government face between fiscal pressure and political survival. Finally, it incorporates collective action asymmetries, where organized groups that benefit from subsidies can mobilize more effectively than diffuse taxpayers. Taken together, this provides a more comprehensive explanation of subsidy persistence in Malaysia than any single theory alone can. However, there are also limitations to my framework. Firstly, it cannot isolate the causal effect of individual mechanisms because these factors operate simultaneously. Secondly, credibility is not directly observed and must be inferred from outcomes such as reform reversals or public resistance. Also, organized interests are treated implicitly. They raise the political cost of reform but are not modeled and act as separate actors due to the limited observable data. And finally, the model does not simulate alternative policy designs or welfare optimal reforms. The aim is therefore to explain why subsidies persist rather than to prescribe an ideal policy solution. So far, I have developed the integrated framework and methodology, as well as compiled the Malaysian fiscal and reform data. Hence, my next steps will involve mapping of mechanisms to evidence, followed by comparative analysis. To conclude, the existing literature already identifies many mechanisms behind fuel subsidy persistence. The key contribution of this project is to integrate these mechanisms into a single economic framework and apply it to Malaysia. The core insight is that subsidy persistence reflects a stable political equilibrium shaped by credibly constraints, political incentives, and also institutional conditions. In other words, subsidies persist not because reform is unknown, but because reform is politically difficult to sustain. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.